Hi, everybody. I am very glad you are here. All right, we are talking about all of our building blocks for our courses, and we're at the point now where we are ready to talk about quizzes. So, we have talked about doing announcements, we have talked about doing pages that we're going to use to make our agendas or share instructions. We have talked about assignments, which can be used for our homework assignments and our classwork assignments. You looked at doing discussion boards. And now, finally, our last big piece is to talk about creating quizzes. So, this is sort of a big one. There's a lot involved in creating quizzes. And so, I've chunked this up for us. I'm just double checking my list of the ways we've chunked it up. So, what we're going to do today is really just talk about what are quizzes, talk about the new quiz interface and the settings that are connected to our new quizzes. In a separate video, we will talk about the different question types and how those work. We'll talk about using item banks. We'll talk about using the lockdown browser, and then finally how to moderate the quiz once students are taking it or have taken the quiz. So those are going to be all separate videos, so we're going to chunk this up a little bit. So let's just go ahead and dive into our first one. So what is a quiz and what do the settings look like? We're going to approach this from two different perspectives here. Get my mouse over here. We're going to start with looking at an existing quiz so you can see one that is already created and what that looks like. And then we'll jump into our sandbox and create one. So for starting, I would just watch, and then once we get into creating one, we can play a little bit more, okay? I don't think I will go into my final exam. Instead, let's just go into my first unit quiz, okay? So actually, here, real quick, before I jump into there, I can tell that this is going to be a quiz because of the rocket icon. So that's the rocket icon or the icon that you will see when you know you're working with a quiz. And we've talked about this before. That's our assignment icon. That's our page icon. So we know what it is simply at a glance by looking at that little graphic there. Okay, so these are our settings to start. What's kind of great about this is that the settings that you have here all the way down are the exact same settings you would have when creating an assignment. So you've walked through all of these before. The quiz type is set for you. It's a graded quiz. The point value, you would enter that. Be very careful to double check that after you've built your quiz to make sure the point value you think this should be is actually what it ended up being when you built the quiz, because you'll have a really hard time getting your grading to sync correctly if you have not made those two numbers the exact same. That's one of those I've learned that lesson the hard way moments. Just like with any assignment, we can put this into one of our groupings. And so I've obviously got this in my Unit 1 assignment group. All of my assignments now are going to be in there. My daily assignments, my classwork assignments, and my quizzes. I can display the grade in those variety of ways that we've already talked about under assignments. How you choose to do this is going to kind of be up to you. I almost always do points. It will tell me the percentage as well when I've done points. So this is out of 30, and if they get 30 out of 30, I do see that that's 100%. You do not have to do anything here with the submission type. That is set for you when you establish that this is going to be a quiz. And then lastly, you have to assign access. And just like with any assignment, you can assign this to your whole class in one go. If a student is ever absent on a day that you take an assessment, you do have to then go back and assign this to them separately. So for example, this person had to take this early, if I'm not mistaken, because he had to go off for a basketball thing. So you can assign different dates to individual students based on their needs. Okay, so that's our front page settings here on, I'm not even into building the quiz yet. And these settings are exactly like those that we've set when we are setting an assignment. Okay. Last thing down here, I will point out is you can attach a rubric to a quiz, and we will talk about that in a separate segment, how to do rubrics. Okay, so if that's all I want to do right now, I would simply save my settings as they are. But let's go into build mode. So build is where we are going to go to actually create our questions, and configure our more specific settings for this quiz. Now, we will talk about the build aspect later, but let me just do a quick glance through here. I think this quiz is heavy on the multiple choice. You can see there's a lot of multiple choice in here, but I should have a short answer question down here. I do, so there's a short answer question. So that's what a quiz looks like, right? My instructions and so on, all right? It's the settings, though, that we're gonna talk about here. And so here's all the different things that you can do for a quiz in progress. We will create a new quiz in a second and we'll walk through these. But you can see I've shuffled the answer. I've required they have an access code. I set a time limit for this quiz. I'll talk very specifically about allowing multiple attempts and why you might use that, even if you don't think you want to give multiple attempts, and then hiding the results from the student. Okay. When I'm done, what's interesting is there's not really a save button in quizzes. There is a return button, and that's the one that you are going to use. Okay. All right, let's go into creating one. So at this point, I think what is good practice is for you to split your screen, get into your sandbox, and put me off kind of in a corner somewhere so you can see a little bit of what I'm doing, but you can be playing in your sandbox. And to that end, I'm going to go into my sandbox. I think. Here we go. All right. All right, so how do I create a new quiz? Well, I can use the quizzes index page to create a new quiz, or I can use the plus button within a module to create a quiz that will automatically go into this module. All right, so either way, I can create a quiz. I'm going to go here. I'm just going to create a quiz. Okay, create a quiz. I'm going to give it a name. What kind of quiz is it? There are different types, right? I can do survey type quizzes. I've never used a survey quiz, honestly. I always do a graded quiz. This is where I would put it into a group. Okay, so that's where in my history course, I have Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3, Unit 4, and so on. And then this is just simply a formatting thing, but let's go ahead and indent it one level. Okay, and I'm going to add this item. Okay, and it automatically puts it right down at the bottom. Let's go ahead and open up that quiz. All right, this is that first page, right? So it's got its name. It's a graded quiz. I'm going to give a point value to this, but I want to go double check that once I've actually created the quiz. But all of this I already set up, and I'm not worried about assigning it out right now. All right, now we're going to talk about building our quiz. All right, let's go into build mode. Again, I'm going to worry about tackling the adding of questions in a separate video. Let's just talk through the settings right now. All right, a lot of these are very self-explanatory, but let's go through them. Shuffle questions. So shuffle questions is going to take my 10 questions and present them to the students in a random order. So if I want them to present to the students in the exact way I wrote the quiz, I do not shuffle the questions. If I want those 10 questions to be presented in a different order to different students, then I would turn this on. Shuffle answers. I always turn this on by default so that as I enter multiple choice questions, for example, it will shuffle the order of those 4 or 5 or more options in the A, B, C, D, etc. Okay, one question at a time. What that does is it creates the screen for the students will literally only see one question on their screen at a time. If I allow backtracking, they can go back to previous questions. If I have this turned off, the students will see the entire quiz and they can go through and scroll up and down through, in this case for my quiz, the 10 questions I presented to them. So one question at a time, they're literally going to see one question. If I have that turned off, they will see the entire quiz. Require a student access code. I always turn this on. Your access code can be anything you want it to be. Okay, it can be all caps, it can be lowercase, it can be a single cap, it can be whatever you want. I strongly encourage you to always enter an access code for every quiz that you give. Okay, if I want a time limit for this, which I almost always do set a time limit for my quizzes, talk to your mentor about that. This is a 10 question quiz. Let's say I'm just going to give them 10 minutes. Okay. I'll now go through this. There's a little string of these that I rarely turn on. Detect multiple sessions. If a student is trying to take an assessment from multiple devices, that would be notified, and I would see that in the activity log. There's such a rare instance where a student would be able to do that, so that's really not something I worry about turning on. I don't worry about filtering IP addresses. I'm a history class, so I don't turn on the calculator. When I taught economics, I often did turn on the calculator though, so depending on what you teach, that could be helpful. Allow clearing sections that literally will go through and if they've already selected something in a multiple choice, they have the option to clear it out. I often don't turn that on. They have the ability to pin a question if they want to come back to that question, so I don't usually worry about that option. Show custom feedback with the results. That's something you can choose what you want to say to them. Changes to the default font size. If you want it to be bigger or whatever it might be, you can change that. Disable document uploads. I do turn this on. It makes the rich text editor entry only by text. They can't actually upload a document into there. Because they're in lockdown browser, that's probably not necessary to turn on, but maybe just a fail-safe. Okay, these last two are kind of important, so let's go through these with a little bit more detail, and then we will wrap this one up. So allow multiple attempts. This is new. Well, it's not new. It's been around for now a bit over a year, but in the greater scheme of things, that's relatively new. I almost always turn this on. Even though I have no intention of letting my students take this test multiple times, I will turn this on. And let me go through that in a little bit more detail. What do I set here and why? I choose to keep the highest score, but you can see my options there. I allow a limited number of attempts, and I give them 2 attempts, their initial attempt plus 1. I require time between attempts, and I always set this to at least a day. Why? Well, if I don't require time between attempts, they can literally submit their quiz and start it all over again. I don't want them to do that, okay? I want there to be time between attempts so that there is work on their part to rectify. If they have failed this and they are going to get an opportunity to improve their grade, they've got to, say, do the study guide and be able to turn that into me, make corrections and turn that into me. So by requiring time between attempts, I'm saying you can't get back into this quiz right away. There's a time limit here, okay? Enable build on last attempt. I always turn that on. And you can see, by the way, this is saving as I go, okay? Wanted to point that out since I saw that. So enable build on last attempt. What that will do is every answer they got correct, it does not make them do that question again. Any questions they got wrong, those will present to them. In other words, it saves their work, and when it presents them with their second attempt, it's only giving them the questions that they got wrong. Okay? So I always turn that on. I don't want them to start from scratch again. I want them to literally build on their failed attempt. Okay? So that's one reason to turn it on, is allowing a student to build on a failed attempt. The second reason I turn this on is it gives me a fail-safe. If something were to happen with the technology in the middle of a test and students' work feels like they got logged out or it froze or whatever, they can go in and grab that second attempt, and I can always come down and just turn this to 0, like on the fly. Okay, so it's a little bit of a fail safe if they go to hit submit and it just freezes or it loops or whatever. Don't worry, all your work is saved. We've got it. Okay, so that's the other reason I will do it. It's like my little fail safe that I've got that there. I don't do it so that they get multiple attempts 90% of the time, 95% of the time, but they've got that fail safe. All right, hide results from students. I almost always turn that on. They actually know a way to get around that, but whatever. But you can filter what they can see. Maybe you just want them to see the points that they were awarded. They got 9 out of 10, but they don't really know how they did on each individual question. So there are a little bit more specifics you can go into on that one. Okay. All right, so that is creating a quiz and adjusting both the assignment settings and the very specific quiz settings, sort of one at a time, looking through those. Hopefully you've been in your sandbox playing around a little bit. I'm going to hit the return button to save all of these settings. I see somebody coming here to say hi, and in our next video, we'll talk about actually building that quiz. Okay, sorry, I had to help a student, but I think we're done anyway. Just wanted to sign off. So stay tuned. We will build a quiz in our next video.